Yeah, so thanks for, first of all, thanks for inviting me. I have to say, I did train as an art historian, so there's been nothing more pleasurable in my work for months than sitting here actually talking about art and nature and poetry and looking at paintings. I have to say, I miss it incredibly, and it's been really sort of fulfilling experience actually to kind of be immersed back in that again. I'm going to sit, right. I have got even worse. So I've got two screens and it's for some reason blowing my mind. So I'm hoping that this is going to work. So I've got 15 minutes and I'm going to try to talk about what is landscape, which obviously is really easy to do in like 4 minutes, and then talk a little bit about landscape from a cultural organisational perspective. And I want to just introduce during that a couple of case studies to show you how I think landscape and wellbeing are operating in a kind of cultural heritage sector. And if there's time, there may be some conclusions, but I will look at Helen when we get to that point and see what time it is. So it may feel obvious to everybody what landscape is, but with everything in my life, certainly, once you try and define it and characterise it as a concept, it becomes unclear exactly what we mean by the term. And a colleague of mine at Historic England called Jonathan Last has actually put on our website a really interesting paper about the difference between the term landscape and the term place. And I can certainly provide access to that after the event for anybody that's interested. And he's much cleverer about this than me, really. I think the points that I wanted to make today really are that landscape is not an area, it is an idea and a conceptualization of space. So one of the questions that I want to kind of raise at the beginning and hopefully just allow us to reflect on at the end of today is what makes an area a landscape. Furthermore, it becomes obvious quickly that the structure of the world in which we live, that is, in which I live, politics, policy, systems, places landscape at the intersection of multiple agendas. And interestingly, we've heard about quite a lot of those this morning. So what I mean by that is that the idea of landscape is approached differently by different agencies and different organisations. So landscape is nature, and we've heard about that today. Nature is something to be conserved. Nature is good for you. So that would be one way of talking about landscape. As a historic environment professional, I might argue that no landscape, certainly in this country, is completely free from cultural impact. It may be nature, but that does not necessarily make it natural. And if by natural, that is, you mean totally independent of man's influence. So landscape is a part of our cultural heritage. And yet our cultural values lead to material impacts on landscape. So you get a kind of circle of impact of culture and landscape and perceptions. And actually, I mustn't digress from my paper, but there's so much in what Cherie said that I think we could unpack in that simple statement that I've just made. So I guess the second question is, how do nature and culture intersect in a landscape context? So the European Landscape Convention, to the implementation of which our work contributes as an organisation at Historic England, defines landscape as follows: an area as perceived by people whose character is the result of the action and interaction of natural and/or human factors. It is therefore partly defined by its character, and therefore we perceive its qualities and characteristics and we respond to them. In fact, the concept of landscape, argue those like Graham Fairclough, who by chance used to work for English Heritage, as we were called when he worked for us, is non-existent, he says, without people. So landscape does not exist without people. It is outside of us and we interact with it. Our relationship with it is seen by some, therefore, as one of engagement and perception, that it somehow sits beyond us. However, as a cultural artifact, if you think of landscape as a cultural artifact, it is also something that we can use as a tool or a mechanism for participatory activities. And in fact, you've all described that today, whether it would be art or the actual landscape. So, for example, I think I might have a slide for this. Sorry. Yeah. So, for example, there's a project called Operation Nightingale, which isn't specifically a landscape project. It's designed to work with veterans with PTSD. It's activity based on archaeological excavation, but within a landscape context, as archaeological excavation always is, arguably. And the archaeological process, not the presence of the landscape, is the mechanism for healing or transformation for Operation Nightingale. Then there are more specifically landscape orientated concepts like Human Henge, which was led by the Restoration Trust, but also with others, including English Heritage and the National Trust. whose role is the development of culture therapy, as they call it, for those with mental health needs. Right, so Human Henge, led by the Restoration Trust, whose role, sorry if this is a slight repetition, so whose role is in the development of cultural therapy for those with mental health needs. So Human Henge involved programmes of facilitated events for groups of around a dozen people with mental health challenges from 2016 to 18. They created fun and therapeutic activities that included singing, dancing, talking, creating, walking, and they measured some of the outcomes. So they talked about evidence of the character of increased social connectivity, confidence, mental health improvement. So there we have this idea, not just of landscape as perception and engagement, but also about participation. However, there is a further school of thought that discusses a paradigm of emplacement, a much more complex and deep interrelationship between body and mind. And this, and I hope this sort of relates back to some of the things that were said earlier actually, but this is about a multi-sensual nature of emplaced perception. So it's not so much about the perception of something being outside of us, a sort of subsidiary, secondary element to our existence, but something embodied. This acknowledgement that landscape works on and through all our senses opens the door for deeper and more meaningful benefits on our well-being as it shifts us from external consumer of landscape to a sense of being. So I guess the other question that I would be asking is how can landscape relate to who we are? So we have perception, engagement, participation, emplacement, and embodied experience. So, and this is where I realised I'd lost you last time. So that's just a summary of the questions that I think I'm kind of posing to myself during that explanation about what makes an area landscape, how does nature and culture intersect, and how can landscape relate to who we are. So thinking about this from a heritage organisational point of view, alongside the conceptual debate about what landscape is, sits an array of factual information about health and health inequity. For example, 1 in 4 UK adults have a diagnosable mental health condition. Presumably it's much higher for undiagnosed mental health conditions. And then Michael Marmot's review of health inequalities, published in 2010 and shown here on the slide, and repeated in January 2020, just pre-COVID, revealed an unacceptable health gap and a slowdown of life expectancy since 2010, with more people living in poor health for longer. And post-COVID, Marmot produced a further report, Build Back Fairer, in December. I'm a massive Michael Marmot fan, as you might be able to tell. And in that, he stated that the nation's health should be the highest priority for government as we rebuild from the pandemic. So well-being is an issue increasingly referred to, as others have mentioned, in policy and looking at social objectives, capturing the idea that individuals are not reaching their potential. High well-being produces a life well lived, and which in Western society includes an element of tangible productivity and contribution to the economic machine. It is well established that well-being can be about subjective well-being, how well is a person doing, and the social determinants of well-being, the environmental factors that provide the context for an individual's life. Differentials in the latter are the creators of the health inequalities identified by Marmot. In combination, these provide the food for the flourishing of mankind if they are addressed successfully. Now, in the heritage sector, there was a publication called The Power of Place in 2000, and it spoke of the emotional resonance of place, memory, and association. In essence, all the things that I still talk about today in my own day-to-day job. But I think whilst acknowledging that it spoke of belonging and its importance, it was as if we knew there was something in it, but we didn't really know how to articulate it in a way that anybody else understood. So heritage in itself is a concept, well, it's a process, but it's a concept of creating cultural meaning from things that exist and to which we associate that meaning. Despite how it is used as a term, especially in a policy context from which I come, it is not static. I mean, we talk about it, you know, in government policy documents as if it's a thing rather than a process, which I think gives it this idea that it's a sort of fixed thing rather than a continuing process. And its interpretation is open to constant questions, and it should be open to constant questions in my view because of that, especially if one is talking about the so-called authorised heritage discourse, which, and all of this could relate back really well to Cherie's talk, in fact. Particularly if we're talking about things like the NHLE, the National Heritage List for England, which is what some people refer to when they're talking about the authorised heritage discourse. So this is the national list of things that have been designated by government as being worthy of protection. and for which we as an organisation are responsible for maintaining. Heritage is therefore, despite this fixed entity that it sort of appears to have, is based on values and is ultimately constantly evolving and often, as Cherie and others have said, often dissonant in its character. Sorry, that was the one I missed, sorry. There are many international references to the value of heritage and the values that are associated with heritage. And so I just show, there's sort of lots that one could show, but I show my favourite, which is the Framework on the Convention of the Value of Cultural Heritage for Society from 2005, the Fairey Convention, to which the UK government was not a signatory. And in 2016, our funding department, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, said there would be an initiative to develop and promote the contribution of cultural sectors to improving health and well-being. This in essence turned into something which is called the Taking Part Survey. That's essentially what they were talking about, which, as some of you may be familiar with, is a kind of national survey and data set that looks at the way that people interact with heritage and culture. It tends, in my view, to focus primarily on heritage as consumption, so heritage through visiting and choosing to visit. And it doesn't talk about place, where you live, local neighbourhood, healthy local environment, sense of being or belonging. It's much more about a quantitative assessment of people choosing heritage or cultural heritage in some way. And then in 2009, Natural England said engaging with the outdoor environment and landscape can bring considerable mental health benefits, and many of you have spoken about those. And I think as a result of that and some of the work they've done, including their recent rapid scoping review of health and wellbeing evidence for the framework of green infrastructure standards, so snappy title, but because of this and other work, it's sort of essentially now taken for granted that green is good. So I'm interested in the idea that green is good, but I'm also interested in this idea that I flagged at the beginning, that green isn't just green. Green is culturally embedded in us and in meanings, and it helps us to understand who we are because of that history and how landscape represents everything that came before us. And I don't claim in any way to have solved the conundrum. But in 2018, we published a report on a rapid scoping survey would be perhaps a generous way to put it, a very rapid scoping survey, let's call it, that just looked at the literature that existed on heritage and wellbeing. And at that time, we divided the relationship between wellbeing and the historic environment into 6 categories. So some would be about process. And for me, that would include things like Operation Nightingale and volunteering. Sometimes it would be about participation, that's visiting, that's the stuff that's in the Taking Part survey. Sometimes it's a mechanism, and all sorts of things that you've talked about today, including, I think, perhaps the Barber Institute stuff. This is a brilliant mechanism for looking at creativity and shared experiences. And so it could be landscape, it could be art, it could be the historic environment. Then there's a lot more in the museum sector than in my own sector on healing therapy and the using objects for healing. But then there's also these 2 other issues about place and about environment. And in this context, we've separated them, place, landscape being encapsulated under that, and environment meaning in this context, the literature talks about environment as being green and outdoors and therefore beneficial. And so there is a kind of policy separation, I think, between some of these concepts. And I think that's what I meant at the beginning when I was saying landscape kind of sits at the middle of all of these things. So I'm just going to try and skip ahead a bit because of time, sorry. So I think there's a real issue, though, about whether heritage protection and conservation is a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And I think there are often questions that are currently asked about, are we simply instrumentalizing something by calling it a mechanism for delivering of well-being? Now, I don't think it's as simple as that, but I do think we need to at least know that we can answer those questions. So I just wanted quickly to mention a couple of examples of things that I thought were interesting and relevant. So the concept of the therapeutic landscape was developed essentially in the 1990s. I mean, we've talked a lot about how, in fact, it was invented significantly before that by artists, but in terms of a kind of articulated theory, referring to points that I made at the beginning about landscape being perceived to be therapeutic. But I thought it would be interesting to put up the National Trust 2017 document, Places That Make Us, in which they stated, and again, this is about visiting, visits to meaningful places evoked feelings of calm, joy and contentment, energy, discovery, identity and belonging. They measured emotional connections through functional magnetic resonance imaging. They stuck things on people's brains to work out what being outside felt like. Obviously, I'm a scientist. Obviously, that's not technical language. But the point is, well, this raises lots of questions for me. I mean, on one hand, I think it's really interesting and valuable. And on the other hand, I just sort of worry that science is the only language anybody understands. And all of the stuff we've talked about today, which is about instinct, has to be proven by science before anybody accepts it. But that's sort of personal conflict, I think I have in my own mind. But I think there is a new and emerging area around neuroscience and well-being and place. But I think it's just interesting to reflect on two of the words that come up in the National Trust document. One is they speak of meaningful places evoking these feelings, and they talk about belonging. Now, a recent research project on visiting heritage after lockdown, which was actually in between lockdown, it was last summer, increasingly identified benefits of some well-being benefits of some kinds were greater for people if they knew that the place that they were visiting was heritage, supporting the idea that that cultural understanding is important, that heritage provides a coded set of ways to provide meaning that people then respond to. Then there's this issue about belonging, here linked to particular places, and it being associated with identity, and by extension, arguably, I would argue anyway, with cultural inclusion. It sounds, I think, a little bit like heritage is sometimes interpreted as. It sounds like a static concept, belonging, and it implies that there are those that do not belong and therefore are excluded from that cultural concept. And I don't think belonging is a bad word. I use it as well because I think it has resonance, but I think we need to be really careful about what we're saying when we do it, and we should actually be talking about becoming rather than belonging. But so there's some recent work by somebody called Claire Nolan, who actually did a bit of work for us on that 2018 document that I mentioned about therapeutic landscapes in and around Avebury and Wiltshire. And I'm just showing you some sort of glorious pictures of the prehistoric landscape of Avebury and Stonehenge. She carried out semi-structured interviews, both seated and walking, and participants were invited to create a reflective written or photographic account representing their personal experience and their perceptions of the archaeology. Through this, she showed the potential of heritage to provide a transitional space for experience to happen, and self-reflection and perspectives on oneself and one's life. And actually some of what she talks about, I think, Jen, is really resonated with what I heard you talk about, the landscape art and reflections on death. She speaks of existential authenticity, imaginative play spaces, everyday creativity, new horizons, liminal spaces, contemplation and resolution. Now, I can't go into all of that now, there isn't time. But I think the key things that came out of her research for me was this idea that being in the landscape created a freedom from the conformity of normal life. It was a catalyst for imaginative reconstruction and the creation of potential pasts and meanings, thinking about how things fitted together, and even about a feeling of inhabiting the past and sharing something with people of the past. And again, I think this really resonates with this idea of being part of something much bigger. And I wasn't going to put it in the talk actually, but one of the things she does talk about is this seeing self as part of a long, deep time continuum, thinking afresh about life and death, and our place in the universe, and that wasn't something which was morbid and depressing, but it was something which was life enhancing through vitality, rather than through this simple idea that landscape is escapism, that actually it's much, much more complicated and interesting than that. So I was just going to very quickly just say, so why landscape and archaeology matter for well-being? And I've just put on the slide some of the things that I think come out of Claire's research and other people's research in these areas, but some of the ways in which landscape and archaeology matter for well-being. And Lowenthal, who, as many of you will know, wrote considerably about cultural heritage, wrote in 2015 that the past is a route to self-realization, and through it we become more ourselves and we become better versions of ourselves. And I'm really interested in this idea of the becomingness rather than just the belongingness. And then, sorry, messing about with my things. And then why does this matter to us as a sector? So it's all very interesting to have these debates, but in the end, my day job is making it mean something in a very, very specific policy context. So why it matters that we understand this rather than just accept it instinctively is partly because I believe we need to make the case for the value of the historic environment, the cultural element of the landscape, the greenness and the nature that we see around us in a landscape context. We are, as a publicly funded body, obliged to demonstrate our public value. And we should be having positive social impact, and we should be understanding the nature of that social impact that we have, good or bad, and therefore we need to understand what works. So we need to think about these things. And these are the three tenets that sit at the heart of our draft Wellbeing and Heritage Strategy. There was lots of other things I could say, but I will just finish by saying these are the sorts of questions that I've tried to raise through the paper. I don't feel that I've answered all of them, and I don't really feel like it's fair to read out my conclusion because we have so much, but I think it would be really nice just to finish that there's a Canadian-born artist, a landscape artist called Tate Godwin, who said works of art are landscapes of the mind. And I was reflecting on this and thought, maybe if that's true, then every landscape that we see is, as the Swiss 19th century writer Henry Frederick Amiel stated, that every landscape is a state of the soul. And I think for me that encapsulates the thing that I'm trying to say about the cultural landscapes in which we place ourselves. But I will stop there and let Helen take over. And thank you very much for listening.